Hello, my name is Irving Finkel, and welcome to the third of 3 new talks about ancient Mesopotamia at the kind invitation of Archaeology Now. And today my title is Disentangling the Divination of Ancient Mesopotamia. Telling the future, in other words. Very, very big subject. So I picked some central plums to share with you, just to give you a taste. And of course, after that, you can go off and read hundreds of books yourselves. There are some very, very substantial compilations of omens from Mesopotamia. One is called Shuma Alu, and you must not be intimidated by the odd bit of Akkadian vocabulary. Shuma means if, and Alu means city. And these are written out on large cuneiform tablets, of which there are 120 in the series. So that's a very long bookshelf when they're all on end. 120 large tablets about a foot tall, and between them they contain about 10,000 omens. Now, omens are things which, in a very pithy and apocopated form, attempt to give you an angle on trying to predict what's going to happen. And the system is if A, then B. That is the structure of it. And those are called omens. And they were familiar to the Greeks and Romans, but they were very familiar to the Mesopotamians. It was one of their hallmark intellectual activities. So we will start off, we're not going to read all the 10,000 omens, do not panic. But the first tablet, line 1, reads as follows in English. Of course, it's better in Akkadian, but it's in English. If a city is set on a height, living in that city will not be good. So that's the first line, and that is something to think about. If you live in a city on a height, living in that place is not going to be good. Well, you might say to yourself, if that is true, why does anybody live there? And there's another point. Everybody lived on hills in ancient Mesopotamia. That's what they did. So you can call it an inclination or a little mountain or a hill or a height, but the principle is the same. This is what's often known in English even as a tell mound. It's the site of an ancient city where people lived for very long stretches of time, generations and generations, sometimes millennia of time, in the same place. And what happened is that as the populations came and went, and epochs came and went, buildings collapse, get crushed down, people build on top, they build on top, and eventually you have a kind of mountain of archaeology waiting to be excavated by archaeologists. And this comes from an ancient Babylonian word, which we call, from Arabic, tell, a tell mound. So this is the thing. According to this first line of this major treatise, if you live on one of those things, life is not going to be good. And the whole point about living on one of them was that life was supposed to be good. So we have to think about that as we go forward. So the thing is this, they had specialists like they did for medicine and for magic, as we talked before in the 2 previous talks. There were specialists who dealt with the prediction of the future, omen specialists. They were very well educated indeed. They had to master a great deal of disparate information, as you will see. And if we imagine just for a second an omen library at the disposal of one of these clever persons who might be private, or they might work for the king, most likely for the king, they had 2 basic fields of operation, that is to say, heaven and earth, because everything in the sky was full of significance, and they studied everything they could, and they reduced them to a system, which meant they understood how things moved between one another and enabled them to make predictions on that basis. So there's a whole load of stuff, omen type activity, concerned with heaven. And then because earth mirrors heaven, the same kind of displays are available there, and the specialists might be an astrologer who worked in the heavens, or a land-based, so to speak, exorcist who worked on happenings here down where we are. And if you were a technician, a specialist in this field, you had to deal with 2 basic types of resource. Because if you posit that certain things have an ominous quality, that they allow the expert to discern what they mean, what they imply, then you have to reckon with this. There were two basic categories. One was what you might call unsolicited, which is things that happen anyway. And then there are solicited things which need procedure. So the things that happen are, of course, by far the hugest proportion of them, and we'll be looking at one or two of them, their characters, in a minute. But that situation, that the person, the expert is there, he hears from somebody what's happened, or there was some coincidence or something special they saw, or a lizard dropped out of the roof into their breakfast cereal, or any number of things like that. They all meant something. And the learned scholar who'd spent his life in libraries reading and reading and reading about all these things and thinking about what they mean, when consulted, would say, oh, I know what that is because we've had that before, or I'll have to go and have a look. This is something unusual, but probably somewhere there's something about it. So that is responding, so to speak, passively to phenomena all around us in the world, just as there are today. And the other category, which is solicited, is things that need procedure. So, for example, at certain periods, they had this idea that if you had a brazier with hot coals and you sprinkled incense on top of it, that the smoke that will be generated, it might go straight up, it might go to one side or another, or it might fragment into a kind of flower shape or swirl around. All the different things that can happen depending on the environment, depending on whether there's any wind, all those sorts of things, to the expert, were all diagnostic. So he would say, well, this has gone to the left and it's spread out at the bottom and the top looks like the eye of a dragon. Well, this is something, we know what that means. And he would give the answer. So these are the active and passive things, if you like, or proactive, to use the modern term, resources that were at the disposal of these experts, and experts they surely were. So perhaps the most famous aspect of divination in Mesopotamia is what we call extispicy, or liver divination. Now, if you've never heard of this before, it might make you go ooh and ah with surprise, because this was a very common practice in Mesopotamia for well over 2,000 years. It's a central activity, and it's the way in which kings got from their court diviners, from their experts on hand, answers to questions which were important to them. And what you see in front of you on the screen is a model in clay of the liver of a sheep. So it's quite realistic. It's got the gallbladder and this, that, and the other things that livers are supposed to have. And you will see that it's marked out in squares. And in each of the squares, there is a cuneiform inscription, because this is ancient Mesopotamia. And when anybody saw a bit of clay lying around, out came the stylus and they started writing. So in this case, they wrote all over this liver model, and the holes in the middle of the squares are the operative point, because this was a system of divination predicated on two remarkable things. One is that all sheep have livers, like, of course, lots of other animals. They have livers, but uniquely in the sheep species, the sun god in heaven, Shamash, who was in charge of lots of interesting things, including justice, he was also privy to what was going to happen in the future. And it was his way, Lord knows why, to use the flat surfaces of a sheep's liver as a kind of blackboard, where he would make marks in the surface, so that when a diviner removed the liver from the host sheep and examined it in every angle, he would discern certain phenomena on the surface, which to him would be very diagnostic. So sometimes you have warts or pimples, and sometimes you have red and green and yellow warts and pimples, and sometimes you have 2 on the left and 3 on the right. There's a whole variety of different possibilities, all of which happen to be mastered. So if you have 3 on the left, it means one thing. If it's 3 on the right, it means something else. And the numbers can increase, sometimes exponentially. And all these details were crucial. So this model was made to train a young diviner who was fully literate, been through all the training, learnt the classics, learnt all the signs, fluent with his stylus, and was going into this very, very important profession, which was characterized by secrecy and highly professional collegiate attitudes. So this is the thing. Shamash writes over the surface of the liver, and the expert examines it. Now, in this case, what he is concerned with is if you find a hole in the liver, because perhaps you've never done this, and I need to assure you of the truth of it. If you do take a hot, slithery, steaming liver out of a freshly slaughtered sheep belly, you will see very regularly all sorts of things which a Babylonian might regard as significant, but a lesion in the surface, which might be some parasite boring through, would be quite a serious one. And this tablet teaches the apprentice that when you examine this liver, you see a lesion here, what it means. And then, of course, if, as is the case, the king in 1700 or so is thinking of going on campaign against somebody in Elam over the border, feels a bit fed up one afternoon, or decides they have to settle an old score. So the army all gets ready and they comb their hair and polish their shoes. And the king needs to know from the diviner whether they should go on Tuesday morning or Thursday morning or leave it to the following week. There might be such a question as this, because what they don't want to do is go on the wrong day, because that would mean from the beginning they were in big trouble. So the diviner had the job, a very complicated job, of A, using all his knowledge to examine the thing for a diagnostic hint, and then communicate this hint to the king in such a way that if it turned out to be correct, marvelous. If it turned out to be a massive screw up and most of the army were murdered on the field and only 8 people came back bleeding, they're going to be after the diviner like anything, and that will be the end of you. So the diviner must always have had a reading of the king's mind at his disposal, so that when he made his pronouncement, he could lean on it in such a way that it wouldn't be 100%, so that there'd be a loophole, something like that. This must absolutely be true, you can imagine. So this is a drawing that made by a scholar in the 19th century of the surface of this liver. Sometimes it's a bit upside down, depending on which way around it is, with all these things on. Now, what is interesting is, I'll come back to that in a moment. What is interesting is what happens about reading these liver holes. So you can imagine that a normal liver might have one, it might have more, but if there is one, the areas which it would inform the diviner fall into basically 3 categories. One is, as you see, warfare, another one is secrecy, and the third one is escape. And in each category, there are 10 or 15 particular holes which have omens under one of those headings. So you can see warfare, I shall seize the enemy's city through a breach and consume his plunder. I being the king, because these things, certainly in the 2nd millennium, were always done for the king. Divination of any kind for a private individual is something which came much later. So that's one of the warfare. One of the secrecies is a prisoner will repeatedly disclose secrets to the enemy. And the escape one I picked out is the people will try to kill a native of his city, but he will escape through the city gate. And you can see from these 3 that they share some allusion to a hole where things can escape, they can disappear, they can fall down through, and it covers these sorts of omens. So all the liver hole symbols would never be on one liver unless it was a really desperate case. It'd be dead anyway by then. But if you have a sheep with a whole liver, all the predictions meant to be made according to where they were on the surface had their own special association. And this illustrates a very crucial characteristic of these omen tablets from Mesopotamia, that they try to cover everything that could possibly be applied, and they do it, as I say, on the left or the right, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and such adumbrations, so that when they have a set of omens, they cover everything. so that when something happened, the professionals would know that it was there in the books. Because what you don't want to do is be presented with something very unusual and not have the faintest idea what it meant, and not have the comfort of what people had said in the past. So this was part of the mechanism which equipped the diviner for practical life in a real environment. Let me go back to this is a picture of a sheep's liver. I don't know whether you've ever seen one in this shape, form, or style. A friend of mine called Ulla Jays, who wrote a marvelous book about liver divination, told me once that she felt she'd been reading this model and reading the text for years and years, and she'd never seen an actual sheep liver. So she went to an abattoir. I thought it was very courageous because she wasn't very big and she wasn't very strong. But she went to the abattoir and she spent a morning with somebody in an apron and a large knife, looking at livers, turning them over, considering which bit was which, because all the different parts of the liver have their own names, like Palace Gate and so forth. And these numbers come from an article where the person had identified causal lobe and this part and that part with the things in it, so that it matched it with the Akkadian text. So in fact, it's for us possible to follow this as it was used by the people in antiquity. Sorry, wrong way. So this is a picture of King Shogi on the right. He was a Sumerian ruler, a very famous one, of the city of Ur, and he had a court. And there's a long description of what went on in this court. Most of the inscriptions are there to show everybody what an important and talented person King Shogi was. And he was the best at everything. And on top of it all, he was the best diviner in the kingdom, according to this extract from one of his self-adulatory statements. Then, as I prepare the sheep with words of prayer, my diviner watches in amazement, open-mouthed. The prepared sheep is placed at my disposal, and I never confuse a favorable sign with an unfavorable one. I myself have clear intuition, and I judge by my own eyes. In the insides of just one sheep, I, the king, can find the indications for everything and everywhere. Now, that's a bit more confident than I imagine most diviners might feel if they were called on in an emergency, a really urgent thing, like, for example, the crown prince is feverishly ill and the doctors are doing their best and they call it, well, is he going to live or not, man? You know, I pay you this salary, what do you think? And such like nightmares could present themselves. And that's why I think they were very glib and very slick about not quite committing themselves. Now, it's always important to see one of these people for oneself. So you see on the right, this is some kind of round installation, sort of, I think, a tent probably, or maybe even a building, divided into four, where practitioners who work in the court are up to doing things about their work. You can see there's a trolley with bottles on, and there's a cross-legged table, and there's a guy maybe putting something in a kiln. And on the left, the bottom lower left, which I tried to blow up, but it's a bit fuzzy. But actually, the whole of this activity is a bit fuzzy, so perhaps you'll forgive me. The guy with the hat on, who looks a bit like an Egyptian, is bending over at a very back-breaking angle the body of a trussed or dead sheep on that table, and he's slitting it open in order to take out this liver and examine, at the behest of Ashurnasirpal, the king in the court, who's probably said, look, I need this now. And the thing was difficult to do in a hurry, because you had to get the sheep, select it from the royal flocks or wherever it was coming from, but it had to be outwardly perfect, because you couldn't have one which had a flaw or had a mean face, or I don't know what, something about it on the outside. They say, no, no, no. They have to get a perfect animal, take out the liver to get a clear message. Now, there's an interesting thing here, because that letter of Shogi, that announcement about how good he is, there's some evidence that when they did this sort of divination in the Ur-3 period, when he was king in the, say, 22nd century BC, what they read of it was more or less binary. They had questions which was yes or no, and that the liver would give them a straightforward answer, which probably allowed him to be so puffed up about it. And there aren't any omens in the Sumerian language at all, because there are hundreds and hundreds of omen tablets in the Akkadian language, which is the Syrian and Babylonian, but not in Sumerian. So we have this reference from Shogi, which is suggestive. It means that they did something like it, but we don't have in the Sumerian language any kind of corresponding source to the vast literature in Mesopotamian cuneiform in Babylonian. So whether this means that actually the Sumerians didn't go in for it very much, or what, we don't know. But there's one interesting conundrum, because the word in Akkadian for one who reads the liver and gives an opinion is the baru, which I've written up there. It should have a long A and a long U. The baru. And a baru is literally a seer. Because you know in English there's a word seer for prophet. You don't often think of it, but what it actually means in English is a seer, somebody who sees. And this is the same with the word baru. It comes from the verb to see or inspect. And this baru is a very common person in the first millennium BC. Now, as we've explained before, in these miserable occasions, and perhaps you remember, that when you have the two languages, Sumerian and Babylonian, functioning together, the two languages overlapping together and having a major influence on the Mesopotamian mind, it is possible to write something in the Sumerian language which you don't read in Sumerian, but you supply the Akkadian equivalent. And the best thing I can always think of as a simple illustration is when you do the dollar sign on a typewriter. Everybody knows that you read dollar, you don't say S with two lines through it. So you supply what you know it stands for. And in our writing systems, that's not very common. But in Mesopotamia, it was a crucial component. So that means that when we have a baru, who is the diviner, we also have a term in Sumerian. And here at the bottom, that thing that looks unintelligible, mash shu gid gid, is the term in Sumerian for a baru diviner. Now, this is a very interesting matter. If they didn't really have these texts, how comes there is a name in Sumerian at all? Because why would they need one? And it could be argued that they made up a mashu gid gid as a special Sumerian equivalent for this word baru later on for religious and mystical reasons. This is possible. But mash shu gid gid means somebody who puts their hand, which is shu, into a goat. And they don't use goats for divination in Akkadian. They use sheep. And a sheep and a goat, to many people who live in cities, are a bit interchangeable, and often people aren't quite sure of the difference. But I tell you this, in ancient Mesopotamia, every child of two knew the difference between a sheep and a goat, and there will be no confusing it. So if you look at this evidence rationally, you would come to the conclusion that in the Sumerian period, they did do something like this, but they used goats and not sheep. So if that is true, I'm not saying it is, it's plausible, then some kind of revolution within the profession must have taken place. So this is what in the late libraries of Ashurbanipal and important kings of the first millennium is one tablet of the results of all this accumulated experience. So they started off in the old Babylonian period in about 1700 BC. And we have some cases like this of an early text on a particular kind of divination, which is quite short, to the point, in fact, even pithy. And then you might have, from a few hundred years later, another one. And then you get these library tablets from the 8th century, 7th century BC in Mesopotamia, where they have hundreds and hundreds of lines of text. And every single case, as I said, they try to cover. So they expand the original core artificially and with some extra experience into something where the original is almost unintelligible or unrecognizable. So what this means is that the principle behind this omen literature and the dependence upon writing functioned in this way, that you have the various activities, astrological, things you observe on the ground, the behavior of animals, all these sorts of different, there's a whole load of things. They all started off with a core of simple connections which people notice. So, for example, if it rains every Thursday for a month and they discover that the king's racehorse has died, there's somebody who think, well, that's a very funny thing. We had this thing here, and then if the racehorse dies some other time and there's bad weather, that's an interesting thing. And you would get a kind of nascent tradition that events of importance or not importance and phenomena of importance or not important might be linked in a way where the original ones actually refer to experience. I'm not saying it's always true, but I think that must be the principle. And once they got hold of it, once it was established that this was a good source, it became very fertile and grew exponentially in all directions to cover every possibility. So that means that someone who wants to read these omens today has to have a lot of energy and patience, because they're rather simple. They're rather, on the whole, they are rather similar, and you have to read them in order to get the full force of the difference between left and right and up and down and back and forth and all the colors and all the other directions is all part of a long, complicated series. And many people have argued that the Mesopotamian mind wasted its time doing this, that you can't, they say, predict the future. Well, that's their opinion. But also that all of their clever minds, their subtle minds, devoted themselves to this stuff. And oh, how foolish was that? If they'd have tried a bit harder, they could have been Greeks. But actually, it's not like that at all. Because when you look at the text as a whole, you can see, firstly, that you have a fantastic quantity of data organized with a high level of efficiency, where the whole of the content is consistent. And when that is motivated by a desire for completion, and it's calibrated on documents in a library, tablet 1, tablet 2, and so forth, as I said, 120 with the Shuma Arlu series, then this is a monument of intellectual production. And it is a very rash person who says this is nothing to do with science, this is nothing to do with anything serious, because I think it is what I would call early science, because the attitudes of the persons, the standards of their work, and their answerability for what they discovered matched what really befalls a scientist today. And you have to take this material as a very revealing indication of the Mesopotamian mind, and not, so to speak, its downfall. One interesting point about this is an Etruscan object. I hope we're allowed to allude to this thing in a Mesopotamian lecture, but this is made of bronze and it's from Etruria. And you can see, even if this is your first dose of livers, that this is a sheep's liver with the promontories that you expect, divided up into different areas and inscribed in Etruscan. So this means that the great ancient tradition of Mesopotamia was regarded outside as a highly definitive and very significant procedure which required mastery, and it exported itself elsewhere. And you even find, we can't really read Etruscan, and we don't have any Etruscan libraries, but you don't have to think very hard to realize what lay at their disposal if they got as far as making models like this for teaching other students and for expounding the art of divination, as they must have done. And there's something else, because lots and lots of Greek manuscripts have been discovered. Lots of them have been published. And sometimes you have libraries in a university where they published Greek documents, which are Homer and other important literary sources, and they're most important. And at the back, they often have a few plates of bits and stuff in Greek. No one's quite sure what they are, but they are Greek and they are real. So we've put them in, and they say literary or unidentified. And there was a volume like this with some plates at the back, and a very clever young person was reading these Greek things, and he realized that they were omens of Babylonian type in Greek. And on top of it, he recognized that some of the special parts, like the palace gate, which is an important part of the Babylonian tradition as part of the liver, was there in Greek translation. It had gone across with a calque of the Babylonian terminology. So that in itself shows that we have a lot of stuff from Mesopotamia and a few treasures from elsewhere, but probably there is a system which overran the entire ancient world at that time, and there were experts and people who professed this knowledge for a very long time afterwards. Now, the other big area which I thought we might have a look at has this lovely title, if you use the old-fashioned words, of auguries from prodigies. And this is not an expression you normally encounter in daily life, but it's just the phrase, because Shuma Alu, you remember, is a large series of things that happen and you see around you, things that take place. Now, this is a different thing. This is called Shuma Isbu, which means if a fetus or a deformed fetus or something like that, it's a bit difficult to put it into English. And there are 24 tablets of this with 2,000 omens, and they are predicated on abnormal births. So you can imagine in ancient Mesopotamia, abnormal births were very, very frightening and very, very significant. And there was a whole science which sprung up about documenting every sort of human birth. And in the same way, you have a core of plausible things. For example, if a baby is born with 6 toes, babies are sometimes born with 6 toes, then that would have this meaning, and it would sure be bad. And if a baby was born with 6 toes, probably the midwife or the father will probably bite it off quick and bind it up, and in 2 days later, it would have healed all over. But there is a clay foot written in about 2000, modeled in about 2400 BC, with an inscription in early cuneiform on it with 6 toes. And the inscription says, "What am I to do? Anam inake. What am I to do?" And someone must have had a baby and gone to the priest, and they said, "Look, we've got this. What does it mean? Is our family cursed? What are we going to do? It's terrible." And the priest said, "What we'll do, we'll make a model with 6 toes, we'll leave it in the temple, and an answer will come." And that must have been the solution of one case that we can see. But there are thousands of these omens. And as you see in front of you, there are births, human births of deformed fetuses, not a pleasant thing to talk about on a summer afternoon, and animal births of the same type. So the animals are goats, cattle, donkeys, horses, pigs, dogs, wild animals, and lambs. And all the wild animals, snakes, and I don't know what, mongoose, rats, the lot. There's an encyclopedia of descriptions of abnormal births, A, by humans, and then B, in the animal kingdom. And the malformations, the things that the exorcist looks for here, not the diviner looks for here, are malformations resembling animal features. So, for example, sometimes it says if a woman has a baby like a dog, looks like a dog, something like that. That's what that means. Then there's absence of body parts, or deformed or incomplete body parts, misplacement of body parts, and presence of excess body parts. Well, this science, known later as teratomatia, was taken very seriously in antiquity. There's nothing more frightening than such a fetus being born or coming to attention with all these sort of characteristics. I think everybody was very frightened of it, and everybody knew something had to be done to expunge the evil it implied. Because the idea of many omens is, if you identify the problem, what it means, then there's a magician who can say, well, we'll deal with this by doing such and such a procedure and everything will be fine. So that is the principle of it. But this is an encyclopedia of abnormalities, and rather gruesome in English. God knows what it was like in reality. But the thing is, if you look for 5 minutes online about the question of deformed fetuses come to fruition or aborted, all those things, malformations and absent extra, they all are attested. Some of them rather drastic, some of them very slight. And the thing about this, one other point I have to say to impress upon you its seriousness in time, is that in antiquity, when there were traditional tablets of information, with ancient information that needed sometimes to be explained because it was a bit complicated, people wrote learned explanations and commentaries about the words. So that if you're reading it and you're not quite sure what this old word means, you could look what some learned person said, this means such and such a thing because of such and such a thing. So it was a kind of extra handbook for the hard bits. Now, this collection of omens from Shuma Isbu has 3 separate types of commentary, not just one, which is normal, but there are 3. So it shows that there was a lot of anxiety to establish what it really meant in each case. Very important. And I imagine that if some freaky birth was born, then they knew what to do. Now, yes, I forgot that this is some of the ones about with a woman giving birth. As you can see, if a woman gives birth and the baby has lion's ears, there will be a strong king in the land. If a woman gives birth and the baby has no right ear, the prince's days will end. If a woman gives birth and the baby has no left ear, the prince's days will be long. And if a woman gives birth and the baby has no ears, there will be distress in the land and the land will be diminished. So that snippet of stuff embodies the basic way in which the first premise can be developed. And as I say, sometimes they go beyond any kind of imagination, and it's quite remarkable. And it's not comic or funny or artificial. The principle is, if you expand it, if it has 12 left ears, 14 left ears, or whatever it might be, it's just in case. You never know. You never know what might happen. And that is, I think, an overriding principle for the expansion of the corpus. So this is a little bit of a tablet of this type. And everybody knows about Dolly the sheep. This is a 2-headed sheep. And in fact, there are 2-headed sheep in the world. I've seen one, because in the museum in Calcutta, when you went up the steps into the foyer, there was a glass cabinet with something in it to attract people's attention. And this thing was a 2-headed sheep. It must have been born somewhere in India, and eventually it went to the Museum for Science, and then they put it out in this case to attract the attention of visitors and make them gawp. But the thing is, I would be quite prepared to gawp over a 2-headed sheep, but in this case it was impossible, because there was so much snot and other excreta on the glass case of people for hundreds of years trying to see through it, that you couldn't see through it anymore. All you could see was a kind of white blur. But I believe if you had a window cleaner come in, you might be able to see something like that in Calcutta. But they are, of course, very rare in the world, and most of these things die in the womb, needless to say. And at the bottom here, you have something which gives you a bit of insight into another side of how this really functioned in antiquity, because this is a fish made of bronze, and it's a certain kind of fish which must be dredged up in one of the Euphrates or somewhere, a known type of fish, and this one came up with one of its characteristic fins not on it, the real fish. And this was at a time when there'd been a really successful battle against the Elamites, won by Nebuchadnezzar, and so they made a link. If a fish comes with this fin missing, it is the omen of the king who will defeat the king of Elam. So that's a kind of explicit showing of how this worked. But there's more to it, because say you had this fish, this was the evidence. This was the evidence. So if you're in Babylonia, what are you going to do with it? You could put it in salt if you were quick, and you could take it to the experts at the college. Or alternatively, you could wrap it in clay, bake the clay, break it open, and use that as a mold to cast in metal the original as it was. And I think that's what's happened here. And I think the idea was that they made a collection of abnormal features, abnormal fetuses, abnormal life forms. And it's not very useful to have them in salt in a jar, because you can't really tip them out and have a good look and pass them around a classroom. That's not so straightforward. But you have a model like that, it's indestructible, and you can pass that around the classroom, and maybe many, many others. And it's possible that somewhere in one of these capital cities, the big palaces, there'll be a room full of these things, all made of metal, waiting to be discovered, because they might have been melted down and reused. But this one is enough to show how it was essential that when something diagnostic, which was a concrete thing, because the king won a big battle that very time, that went into the archive as a teaching record for the future. And this is an example. I said about commentaries. I don't expect you to read this, but this is a commentary from this thing about snakes. It goes with Shuma Alu, actually. It's about snakes and the behavior of snakes, because there are lots and lots of omens about snakes and lots of difficult words. And this is a very densely written tablet which has on it the meanings of the omens about snakes. And the omens are explained not by the snakes themselves, but by the words and where they occur in religious texts. They kind of quote it to give it a kind of extra life. So that's one of the sorts of things that an explanatory text that a diviner would also have to study, as well as the omens. Now, rather interesting that Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria, the greatest man in the world since Billy Graham, and he had this great library we talked about before. And he had a chief scholar called Balassi in the court. In fact, he taught Ashurbanipal to read and write cuneiform when he was a boy. He was a great scholar, Balassi, and he wrote a letter about Shuma Isbu to the king, which is quite revealing. And that's why they had these commentaries. Shuma Isbu is difficult to interpret. The first time I come before the king, my lord, I shall personally show with this tablet I'm sending to the king, my lord, how the omen is written. Really, the one who's not had the meaning pointed out to him cannot possibly understand it. So this is the same thing about these commentaries, because Balassi obviously had access to the Shuma Isbu commentaries and was quite aware that the king, who liked reading these things himself, and might have scratched his head over this omen or two, because I'm not quite sure what the syntax means here. And Balassi would come and explain, perhaps with this commentary as well, or by quoting from it, what it really means. So this is another little window on the reality of the stuff among the people who did it. So, nearly finished. This is the point about all this stuff. Shuma is the word for if, like Shuma Isbu and Shuma Alu, it is the word for if. It's a very important word, because lots of things in Mesopotamia were codified, not only omens, but medicine, because if a man has this trouble, this will happen. And law codes, if you do this, that will happen. It was a natural framework for ordered diagnostic material to be collected for reference. And the Babylonians themselves called all that literature, unrelated in itself, but exhibiting this formula, the shumas. They were the ifs. That was the way scholars referred to them, the ifs. So in our omens, we have what's called a protasis and an apodosis. So the protasis is at the beginning and the apodosis is the consequence. Now, if you read about this stuff, and I hope you will dip into it because it is endlessly fascinating, if you do, you will find that these omens are translated like this. If A occurs, B will happen. And I've already indicated to you the flaws in this system, because if it was actually going to mean you had a bad life if you lived on a hill, nobody would. And if you told the king, you'll be absolutely safe on Thursday by my life, king, don't worry a bit, and it doesn't work. And if a doctor said, if you do this, you will get better, and you don't get better, what doctor can ever say, if you take this, you will get better? They say, nah, if you take this, you might get better. You could, you should, I hope you will. People always do. People usually do. It says so in all the books. But the whole essence of this system cannot be that if A occurs, B will happen. It cannot ever have been. And it certainly cannot have functioned between human beings in a system, one turning to another for an answer. Nobody would put their neck on the line and say X will happen. So my belief is that the whole of the Omen literature, which is a back-breaking library full of resources, you have to understand, if A occurs, B might, could, should, or will happen. And the thing is, in the Akkadian language, you haven't got modal forms whereby you can really do in text, say it might happen, should, could, and so forth. And it must be possible, it must have been possible for them somehow to communicate this issue, because you can't have a language without this possibility, or no one's found it syntactically or grammatically, as far as I know, in Akkadian. So it can only be that when the king asks something, then the solicitor, the diviner behaves like a solicitor, noises like that, hedges it around with, I'd like to be, we have to think and all that. It must have been like that, because it could never have worked for 2,500 years. The idiots will say, if A happens, B will happen, because it probably never, ever did. So they're not idiots. So this seems to me an important understanding. I mean, you can't translate every omen. If a frog falls from the ceiling into your breakfast cereal, it might, could, should mean that the king will have a puncture in his bicycle, because it's very cumbersome. But the way to understand it must be that this is a subtle, gloriously intellectually clever system, whereby you have a framework and you have a tradition of hallowed knowledge, but the exponents of it must have been magicians in themselves, because they could indicate with the slightest thing to the king. It says here, but and all that. It must have been like that. And if you read these texts, it makes a big difference about how interesting they are. And then finally, a word on origins and process. One of the really big things in divination in Mesopotamia, which I haven't really talked about, is astrology and the study of the sky. Now, I have an idea about this, which is important if we try to imagine how this omen thing became so deep-seated in Mesopotamian culture, that we have these mountains or pieces of writing. So you live in Mesopotamia, you have a lovely supper, and you go and lie down on the roof, and you put your head on your hands behind the back of your head, and you look up at the night sky. And what was it like? Well, it was a drive-in movie, because there was no pollution, no smog, no aeroplanes, no nothing. And the whole of the night sky must have been brilliant, like a drive-in movie. And everybody in Mesopotamia, but everybody must have known the night sky really well, because they saw it every day before they went to sleep. And some of those people who looked up there and thought the gods live here, and this is the moon, and they sort of think about mythology, things they know and ideas. But some of the people noticed that something that was over there a few weeks ago is now over here. So how can that be? How can that be? And you only want one clever person to ask this question. And then they start collecting information. They watch, they study, they watch, they study, and they find the paths that the stars follow and how things move around, and they understand about the ecliptic, and they understand about, and they can predict eclipses, and they know everything, a million times more than most people in the world today, about how the sky works, how all that stuff works. And they did it because basically it was part of their daily lives, except at night. And he only wants a few persons to ask themselves, how can it be that the Milky Way, hello, and then you have the beginning of astronomy and astrology. So the astronomy side of it is the observation of closely observed phenomena, so that you can understand the principles of it and predict its future development. And astrology is a kind of cousin to it, where the same observations are associated with happenings and predictions about people's lives, the king or a personal horoscope, whatever it will be, which is vested in the same fabric above your heads. So this is part and part of the intellectual process whereby omens of a certain kind came into being. And then we have the other stuff about the stuff on the world. Now, when you went to school in Mesopotamia, perhaps you spoke Akkadian, Babylonian, that's to say, or Sumerian. But when you went to school, you had to learn both languages completely, because all the knowledge was bilingually transmitted. So all the vocabulary was written out so that you learnt the Sumerian and the Akkadian for each word. And all the signs were sorted out in order so you could learn them in order, and what their names were and what they meant. Everything had to be learned by heart. And you had this fabric in your mind when you graduated, that you had a fully bilingual mind when it came to reading and writing, which is not something that exists in the world very commonly. But the effect of it was a kind of built-in structure that the left and the right were connected. And this is an essential principle about cause and effect, and this leads to that. But just as in a lexical text, when you say one word means another, it doesn't mean it's the same thing, because you can't translate from one language to another with a word that means exactly the same. You can't do that. It means that one word sometimes means this, and things of this kind. It's all very subtle. So they had to learn this, and was built into their mind that you have a word which means something, but sometimes it doesn't mean it, sometimes it means something else. And I think this intellectual mechanism of interpretation, of juxtaposition, of explaining one thing in terms of another, and the nature of another dictating how it's to be understood, underpins the whole of the Omen matter. That's it. They had this balance in the world, balance in their universe, and that things had a reciprocal effect on one another, but not that one always meant the other, because it was always subtle and delicate. And I think it's a great mistake to underestimate the subtlety and beauty of the Babylonian intellectual mind at its best. Thank you.